Good afternoon, everyone. As the Dean of Duke Law School, it is my privilege to thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. This program is part of the law school's broader diversity and inclusion work to address structural racism. We are here today to talk about how structural racism culminates in violence against Asians, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders, and specifically the rising anti-Asian violence over the past year, including the recent Atlanta shooting and killing of 6 Asian women and 2 others. It's important to recognize this type of violence does not occur in a vacuum, and we are gathering today against the backdrop of police violence against Black men, including most recently Derek Chauvin's murder trial and the horrific killing of Daunte Wright by a police officer in Minnesota. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing pain imposed by these most recent events, as well as the stress inherent in daily life for our students, staff, and faculty of color. It is critical that we recognize the impact that violence, bias, and sometimes simply talking about these issues has on so many directly affected members of our community. Please remember that support is available for students through Blue Devils Care, Student Affairs, and the Dean's Office, and for staff and faculty through personal assistance services. As a law school, we must recognize the long and often overlooked history of legal discrimination against Asians and Pacific Islanders in this country, and the role of law in both perpetuating and dismantling that discrimination. Today's event will situate anti-Asian bias within the conversations that we've been having throughout the year about structural racism and discrimination. Before we begin, I want to thank the group of people who made this event possible. Bethan Eynon, our moderator today, has worked with many people, including James Lambert, Rachel Greason, the leadership of APALSA, which is the Asian Pacific American Law Students Association, and many other students and faculty to shape and plan today's event. And although Bethan will be introducing them more extensively, I also want to extend a warm welcome and thanks to our 3 panelists, Jo-Ann Yoo, Stephen Lee, and Duke Law graduate Robert Chang. We know how busy and in demand you are, and we are grateful that such a distinguished group of panelists is willing to spend time with our community to help us better understand the origins and causes of anti-Asian violence. Thank you. Bethan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean Abrams. Hi, everyone. I'm Bethan. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as an Asian American transracial and transnational adoptee from South Korea. I'm excited to focus on these issues with you today, which in my experience can often be lost in conversations about race, especially in the South where Duke sits. Our goal is to give you a framework so you can not only analyze the rising violence against Asian people, but also make sense of how it is a direct outcome of the way that Asian identities are framed in America and how structural racism functions as a whole. We'll then spend some time unpacking how other examples of the anti-Asian bias are also a part of this larger picture. Staff, students, and faculty talked about balancing introducing this framework while also providing action items and suggestions for disrupting bias. We know that everyone is eager to do something towards change. But given that we only have an hour, this program will intentionally prioritize the framework and analysis, though I do have questions if we have time about actions individuals and institutions can take, and the panelists may address some of these things in their answers. This is very intentional so that we as a community can walk away understanding the same context. It's also in recognition that action without context can easily reinforce the very inequalities that we seek to disrupt. To those new to these ideas, I hope this panel will offer an introduction and language for further learning. To those who are familiar with these concepts, I hope you engage and challenge yourself further. And to those who live these experiences, I hope you find validation. I also urge you to take care of yourselves, as I know that sometimes even listening to others talk of these issues can be empowering, yet also take a toll. A few logistics quickly. Note that there was a document QR code in the intro PowerPoint slide, which we'll share in chat here soon. That includes additional resources, including self-defense strategies and bystander intervention trainings, as well as our panelists' full profiles. As you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. So the chat feature has been turned off. And after the event, I and panelists will be in my Zoom room We'll link you in chat. The ID is just my first and last name. Feel free to stop by and ask questions, give feedback, or say hi. Now I'll briefly introduce our three panelists. Note again that full profiles are available in the shared document that I'll share here soon. And then we'll get going. Jo-Ann Yoo is the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation, a membership organization in New York City that works with the nearly 70 nonprofits that represent and support the Pan-Asian community. She has deep ties to community and brings a lifetime of experience in community development and immigrant rights advocacy, having worked in the past as Asian Americans for Equality and the New York Immigrant Coalition. She also has a JD. Robert Chang is a Duke Law alum and a professor of law and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality at Seattle University School of Law. He is the author of more than 50 articles, essays, and chapters published in leading law reviews and books on critical race theory, Lat Crit theory, and Asian American legal studies. The Korematsu Center's research is focused on understanding the relationship between law and categories of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, age, and disability, and especially regarding their intersections. Bob also teaches in his law school's civil rights clinic. Stephen Lee is a professor of law and associate dean for faculty research and development at UC-Irvine School of Law. He writes at the intersection of administrative and immigration law and is interested in how enforcement realities constrain immigration law and policy across a variety of contexts and institutions, especially in the workplace, the criminal justice system, and the food industry. His recent projects have examined the purpose and function of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program and the structural implications of prosecutorial gatekeeping in state courts. I'm going to start by having each of our panelists introduce us for about 5 minutes on one aspect of anti-Asian bias, and then we'll open it up for panelist questions from me. So first, Jo-Ann, could you describe your work in New York City and what you're seeing on the ground in the Asian communities that you help support and advocate for?
Sure, thank you for inviting me. The Asian American Federation is a leadership organization, and we're a convener of all of the social services that serve the Asian American community. Our members are nonprofits that are Asian-led and Asian-serving. There are about 70 groups in New York and growing, 70 and growing. Asian Americans are 16% of the population. 28, we have 51 city council districts. Of the 51, 28 have at least 10% Asians, which makes us, if we are able to coalesce, that makes us a very influential voting bloc. Our work really has, during the COVID crisis, our work was really about speaking out about what was happening to the small business community, about anticipating the hate incidents and the hate crimes that eventually became reality, and working with different elected officials, working with City Hall, working with the governor's office to demand action, to make sure that there's some safety and recording mechanisms in place to make sure that we were able to, support the victims as we needed, anticipating where things are going to happen. So that's just a brief introduction of the Federation. Recently, couple weeks ago, we released the Hope Against Hate campaign that really addresses how to stop all the attacks on Asian American communities. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit in the course of our conversation. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So next I'll go to Bob, and to be upfront with everyone, Bob's going to get a little more time than the rest of our panelists at the outset. This was negotiated between us all, so everyone's okay with it, because he's going to cover a main area of his scholarship, which are the historical underpinnings of anti-Asian bias and how it fits within this larger picture of structural racism that we're talking about today. So Bob, can you lead us through this?
Sure. Thank you. And I think it's great that there's an APALSA now at Duke, because when I was there weren't enough of us to even have an APALSA. And so, I want to begin by locating myself in this conversation. And in part, I grew up as an Asian American, a Korean American in Ohio, small town. And my formative experience with race and racism took place when I was in 6th grade. After a month-long festival of name calling, the typical things that Asian Americans are called, everything stopped when a student called me the N-word. Although of course I don't know what it's like to be Black in US society, I do know what it is like to be other. And as painful as that experience was for me, it's something that I always reach back to. And also as a way to draw connection to others. I know what it is like to be other. And so that is a point of connection where I can speak with others about that. And so, when I experienced that, I didn't have the tools, I didn't have the history, they didn't teach these things in school. And I think it's really important for us to understand that history. And so years later, when I had the opportunity to learn this history, I learned about things like the 1854 case of People versus Hall. And so George Hall is a white man who was convicted of killing Ling Sing, a Chinese immigrant. He was convicted in 1853, and he was convicted in part based on the testimony of Chinese witnesses. It went up to the California Supreme Court, and the question was it error for that testimony to be admitted? At the time in California, there was a statute that said that no Black person, mulatto, or Indian could testify against a white man in a criminal trial. And so then, well, what do you do with the Chinese? The Chinese had only started coming to the US following the discovery of gold in California. And so the California Supreme Court, exercising word magic, decided, well, ethnographic theory at the time says that the Indians in the US came from Asia, and so statutorily, Chinese are Indians, and so the testimony should be excluded. Realizing maybe that they were on thin ground, they decided, okay, well, let's think about Black. We'll understand Black as being all non-whites, and so Chinese are Black for purposes of the statute. After that, the legislature amended the statute to include Mongolian. But one key thing to remember about this is at the very beginning of this, it's not just about discrimination against Asian Americans or Chinese immigrants or Chinese Americans. It's against all non-whites who are not allowed to testify, who are not able to protect themselves, who don't then get the protection of the state in a circumstance like that. The historian Gordon Chang recently in a recent talk talked about how there were hundreds of murders of Chinese immigrants. And these murders were made possible because private violence was not remedied because the protections of the state were not there. This gets carried forward and then, part of locating Asian Americans within this history is understanding the role, the function that Asian immigrants played in the US economy. And so US capital had a thirst for cheap labor. Chinese immigrants initially filled that role. Now, one of the things is that in order for Chinese labor to continue to play that role, you needed to prevent them from forming families. And so, Dean Abrams actually should be a panelist here. Her work on the 1875 Page Act, ostensibly to keep Chinese prostitutes out of the country, is really targeting Chinese women. Because if Chinese women come, you get immigrant communities formed, you get multi-generational communities formed, and you no longer have the contingent disposable labor force. Now, having a contingent disposable labor force is crucial because of the way that it plays a role in racial stratification. And so part of it is you underpay Chinese immigrants. It fosters economic resentment and violence by white workers who are doing what any of us are trying to do, which is to find our way in US society. And so this is all part of racial stratification that operates after the 1875 Page Act, you had the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, where political forces worked to exclude Chinese laborers completely. And so following that, you had, when that source of cheap labor is excluded, Japanese immigrants filled that role. You had that source closed off by the 1905-1906 Gentlemen's Agreement. But there's a loophole there. Although Japan stopped issuing visas for laborers, they issued visas for picture brides. And so that's one of the reasons that you had multi-generational immigrant communities formed for Japanese Americans. Following the cutoff of Japanese labor, you had South Asian immigrants filling that role. That was cut off by the 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act. So instead of naming a group, by saying, no more South Asians coming in, they actually just did it, Asia, and they set off longitude and latitude to exclude South Asians. After this, Filipinos filled that role. And Filipinos came in under a different category because after the 1898 Spanish-American War, the Philippines was a US colony, and so they were US nationals. And so the way to eventually cut off that immigration was the 1934 Tydings-McDuffie Act that formally granted independence to the Philippines 10 years later, but then reclassified them so they could no longer come in as US nationals, setting a quota of 50 Filipinos per year coming in. Now, in the midst of all of this, so part of my narration of this immigration story is this is part of the construction of Asians as a separate racial category. And then in addition to excluding literally from the borders, you get the citizenship cases. And so in 1922, Ozawa versus the United States, in 1923, United States versus Thin. And so then you have the question, can Asians naturalize? Although you have the earlier case of Wong Kim Ark that says if you're born here, you get to be a U.S. born citizen. These cases made clear that Asians could be classified as ineligible for citizenship, which then sets the framework for all sorts of discrimination, including things like various alien land laws that preclude Asian immigrants from owning land. And so what happens then is that states get to discriminate against Asians without naming them. And so in a 1923 case, Terrace versus Thompson, the US Supreme Court is trying to decide, is Washington's alien land law constitutional? Is it discriminatory against persons of Asian ancestry? And the thing is, because the statute said aliens ineligible for citizenship, the US Supreme Court said, well, if it's rational for the federal government to discriminate on that basis, well, that itself is rational reason for Washington state to do so. And so you get exclusion from professions, you get exclusion in all manner of things. And eventually these things get rolled back. But part of why America looks the way that it does, part of why Asians are the perpetual foreigners is this construction of Asians as not desirable, those who are to be excluded, those who cannot become part of our national body. And so, it gets perpetuated by the racist immigration quotas. I'm just going to pick a year randomly, 1963. In 1963, the per continent quota of immigrants from Europe was about 100,000. The per continent quota of immigrants from Asia, 2,000. The per continent quota from Africa, 1,000. And so it's by design that the country looks the way that it does. And so I think I've used all of my 10 minutes. And so I want to be mindful of that. And so let me just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the next person we'll go to is Stephen. And one of your interest areas, Stephen, is how we translate this history into social change. So can you talk more about your ideas and thoughts around that?
Great, thank you. So first, let me just say thank you to Bethan and James and Kerry and Rachel for their work organizing this event. And also thank you to Apalsa for organizing yourselves to push the institution to put on something like this, because I think it is important to gather during these moments, even if it's virtually, just to kind of create space to reflect on these issues. So Bethan asked us to begin with how we identify, and I just wanted to share that I identify as an Asian Islander. I identify as Korean American. I was born in Detroit, Michigan. I was raised in New Mexico, and I spent most of my college and work years in California. So I'm the child of immigrants, and as I'll talk about later in the hour, I actually think that's a category or an identity that's really important to understanding the Asian American experience. And a part of that has to do with the backdrop that Bob has provided for us, which is that for much of this country's history, Asian Americans were the target of race-based exclusions. And of course, formally, the law changed in 1965, opening up a wave of migration. And so my parents came to the United States against that backdrop as a part of that wave. So to get to Bethan's question of how we translate this history into social change, the specific question that I often think about as an immigration scholar is, what do we learn about race when we center the experiences of Asian Americans? And when you center the experiences of Asian Americans, obviously immigration law becomes important, and immigration law and citizenship law becomes a place to locate a lot of this, sort of white supremacy impulses that, again, Bob painted. But for me, I'm really interested in how that kind of operates today in the 21st century and whether there are still effects of this. So a part of this has to do with the fact that, the term Asian Pacific Islander, Asian American, is a political identity that was formed within specific historical circumstances, namely, social change and objection to, colonialism and a demand for ethnic studies in the late 60s and 70s. But if you look at today, the Asian American community, it's growing in significant part by migration. And so that means that a significant number and percentage of Asian Americans don't identify as Asian Americans, right? So let me give you an example. In some of my empirical work, I sort of studied how different community-based organizations try to translate and provide access to Asian immigrants to various government programs, like, for example, deferred action and citizenship applications and naturalization. And I talked to some of these organizations that try to serve a very broad cross-section. And I'd be curious to hear if this comports with Jo-Ann's experiences as well. But these organizations would try and pitch events like naturalization fairs in terms of language accessibility to Chinese language speakers, to Vietnamese language speakers, to Korean language speakers, but they would set up in Chinatown. And so despite the fact that the language access was there, only Chinese migrants would come. So when they talk to participants or people who didn't come, constituents, they say, well, we didn't think it was for us. We thought it was just for Chinese, even though that, again, the language access is there. So that seems like a rather trivial point, but again, the sort of impulse to extend government resources to communities happens in this reality. So that means that organizations now are limited in terms of how many people they can reach. These are significant resource constraints that are tied to people's self-perception. Again, a large number of people who might be perceived as Asian American, but who don't identify as that. So then if you draw out to 30,000 feet in the air and you start asking, well, what is then the basis of the sort of Asian American identity? You see that a large number of these individuals who migrated from different countries are here in part, at least, because of the United States history with war and empire, today manifested in trade policy, immigration policy. And so that, it becomes very difficult then to try and mobilize people other than through this kind of very abstract idea. Now, again, of course, that's not an abstract idea to many children of immigrants, because if you grow up in the culture, if you grow up here, you see American war and reflections of this all over the place. I was just listening to a great podcast interview with novelist Viet Nguyen about the reason why he chose to focus on the Vietnamese experience in the United States. And he talks about, he's a little older than I am, but he talks about growing up in the context of Rambo movies and all these sort of reflections of Vietnam, and it sort of naturalized the dehumanization of Asian Americans. And I was a little bit younger, but that still resonates with me in terms of how I perceive this. I'm at 5 minutes. I have more to say on this, but I think I'll just conclude by saying that far and away, the thing that I think is the most challenging thing about being an Asian American as a kind of racial category is the difficulties in organizing across different historical directories and also between generations. And that's one of the things that I love to get people's thoughts and insights on, because I think that's going to be critical to try and translate this moment into lasting change.
Thank you. And actually, I'll ask our panelists to turn their videos on as well, because we're going to move into just more of a conversation now. And I'd like to toss it, before I go into my next formal question, I'd like to toss Stephen's question over to Jo-Ann. And can you kind of describe to me any challenges or maybe the lack of challenges that we may not anticipate in your organizing work and your support work for the community?
No, when Stephen said that before he said my name, I was thinking, man, this is me every day, right? It's difficult, in New York with all of the diversity. People definitely identify more ethnically. So they say, I am Chinese, I'm Korean, I am, Nepali, but they don't say Asian American, interestingly. And I think for our work, really, what we point out to the community is no one community is strong and large enough to be able to make any kind of policy changes, right? Like the Chinese community, the immigrant community, second largest immigrant community in New York City, but they're not big enough to make policy changes. They're not that, but if you join forces with other Asian immigrant communities to say we are Pan-Asian, I think that definitely makes you much stronger. And so the work of the Asian American Federation is to do that, to be able to convene. So, our membership and the people we work with, it really does include, anybody who identifies as Asian. We are all, and all over the geography of New York City as well. We work with Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, South Asian, East Asian, that for the Federation, if I have to raise money and share that, I have to spread it around to a lot of different people. But I think the reality is that there's a lot of commonalities that we have, despite the fact that we might not necessarily identify as Asian Americans. The fact that, the language access issue is very real. The fact that the Asian American community, the Pan-Asian community doesn't necessarily get the attention or the resources from various government sources, that's very real. So there's a lot of policy things that we work on together that that our work really, the Federation's work really binds our communities together to be able to draw out the commonalities. And so, that's part of the work. But I wanted to share a funny story. As Stephen was mentioning that, I remembered, and I actually sat here and I wrote a little note because I was laughing that, during Hurricane Sandy, when the waters came rushing in, so a lot of Chinatown was flooded. And so a lot of seniors didn't have power or water. And so different FEMA folks came through to say, this is how you fill out the form. Here's all of these explanations. And they ran out of Chinese forms. So they brought all of these Vietnamese forms and said, basically, like, here you go. I brought you some forms for you to fill out. And I'm thinking, you can't even figure out which language you're supposed to serve us in. And in that way, if you're not Asian American, you don't understand, that you can't bring a Vietnamese form into, a disaster area where it's the predominant residents are Chinese. If you don't know enough to do that, then perhaps you should not be doing disaster relief work. But it is one of those things that as advocates, we all kind of secretly, when we get together, we secretly laugh about that. Like, this is what we have to overcome. This is what we have to teach people. The fact that people can't even figure out what form is what, and they think that we are interchangeable and our languages are interchangeable. It is the work that we still need to get to.
Yes, go ahead, Bob.
So Simone de Beauvoir said that women are made, not born. And that's an insight that I really draw to racial identity. So Asian Americans are made, not born. And I want to point out, a couple sort of historic moments where Asian American identity was really propelled. And so during the 1960s, with the Black Power movement, there was a nascent Yellow Power movement, but there were protests actually by Filipinos saying, well, we're not yellow, we're brown. And so activists actually moved from yellow to a construction of Asian American as an avowed political identity intended to be an organizing tool. It's interesting then to think about other moments where a stronger Asian American identity emerged. And one of those followed the killing of Vincent Chin in 1982 in Detroit. And so Vincent Chin, a Chinese immigrant adoptee of Chinese parents, Chinese immigrant parents, was killed by two white Detroit auto workers. And part of it was, he was blamed for people like him taking away their jobs. And it actually propelled a political movement organizing that really focused on constructing an Asian American identity, because violence, they can't tell what you are. And so it's interesting then to think about how this moment with the anti-Asian hate incidents and also the Atlanta spa killings, and how that might be another moment where there might emerge a stronger Asian American identity.
And I saw, sorry, I'm pausing because I saw a question come through, and Stephen, you had tagged it. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that now or we can wait.
Yeah, I was just going to say that question is great. The question about how we can develop a cohesive identity in this country under these circumstances, given the complicated, entangled history that brought people here in the first place. Yeah, I think that's great. And I really like what Bob just said about Asian Americans are made, not born. And I think it, and I also think that applies more broadly. I think it's easy to sort of assume that there's a kind of organic or natural identity that emerges in like the Latinx community or in the Black community. And I think a lot of different communities have their own struggles with heterogeneity. And I think in the Asian American context, I think it's expressed in these specific terms of colonialism and anti-imperialism. So I guess I would say that I don't know if there's ever going to be a single cohesive identity that captures every single struggle that faces people who identify as Asian American. So, I think it's a kind of moment by moment thing and something that you develop over time. So as to this specific question then, I do think that one frame that I've seen historically has been the anti-imperialist frame. I mean, that's, I think, what the late 60s was about. I think that's sort of what Bob was alluding to, this kind of yellow power, this idea that, racial injustice in the United States at the hands of the state is not separate from the larger empire ambitions of, happening in Vietnam. And I think that would also apply to critiques of other countries, that other sort of, countries in the global north began extracting resources from the global south, began targeting the global south and committing those sorts of atrocities. I think Asian Americans shouldn't be afraid to call that out. And I think you saw that again in a lot of sort of Asian American circles. So in that case, this is one of the reasons why, I mean, this is a separate conversation, but I think this is one of the reasons why there are many Korean American activists who are really calling on other Asian Americans to criticize, like Ramsayer in Japan, for your refusal to recognize the comfort women and like sexual slavery. Again, because if you really profess to care about race that was born in the context of anti-imperialism, then we should expand the frame and expand the universe of targets beyond just the United States.
So I know we could make the whole panel about this conversation. I want to move on and modify it just a bit to add in, maybe I'll just add layers onto this conversation as we go on. So I wanted to bring in, and Bob had already mentioned this explicitly, the Atlanta spa shootings and killings, including 8 people, but 6 Asian women, and how gender overlays on top of all of these issues. Perhaps, Jo-Ann, you can clue us into how the violence, including these killings now, have changed or modified how the community is interacting or feeling on the ground. And the kind of connecting for us, how that relates, it seems so recent and so modern, how that relates to this history and context.
Sure. So, we're all watching and being supported by Professor Russell Jung's work at Stop API Hate, and as he's been collecting those data, he said there have been 38 instances nationally of Asian, anti-Asian incidents. in New York, every time he reshuffles his data, he will send us and says, hey, Federation, here's the New York numbers for you guys. And then we have our own collection site, and we get it from various sources, including his. And so we were at 800, and then our member agencies started to keep track of all the incidents that their clients were coming in telling them. So that brought us to 1,100. And so New York, I think, is a city with the greatest number of incidents right now. But we know that that's only 10 to 30% of the actual numbers of incidents that are taking place. I think New York City NYPD recorded 33 hate crimes since last year. There's an ongoing fight I'm having with NYPD as we speak because of the way they're tracking data. And we found out very early on. Yesterday we issued a statement because NYPD, how law enforcement tracks things that happen to the Asian American community. And I would say, everybody thinks what is happening to the Asian American community is new. It's not new. It's been happening for a very long time. People don't ask us, and we don't report it, right? Because of so many, cultural issues, interactions with police. There are many reasons why Asians aren't reporting. And so for people to think, oh, this is all new to the Asian American community, that would be, that's not true at all. When all of this happened in New York, and, what we started to see in New York starting January of last year, the conversations that I had with city leaders, I said, I'm telling you something bad's going to happen, right? And I said, I don't want to say it because it puts the fear, the innermost fears into the universe. And so that fear was actually exactly what happened in Atlanta, is that somebody was going to go out there and members of our community would be killed. And, as we understand, we already see how that is being, that was spun, with the law enforcement, with media, and the kids saying, like, the sheriff saying, oh, the kid had a bad day and it's not a hate crime, right? But the kid went out and bought a gun in the afternoon and then targeted Asian American spas because it's the hypersexualization of, Asian women. That's what ended up happening. And people say it's not a hate crime, but how can you say it's not a hate crime when he, there were many, many spas in between the 3 that he went to, right? And so how we see it in the advocacy world is he sought those people out. And some of the places he's been, as I understand it, he was a customer. And so the really painful, terrifying, thing that we think about is the fact that some of the women who were killed, they may have recognized his face. So maybe they weren't fearful until that horrific moment when he was killing them, right? And so, this is one of the big pushes that we have in the Asian American community in New York right now. If anything happens, you've got to report it. And we've seen all of the videos of just, the stabbing and the beating and, and us working with the victims to figure out how do we make sure that they get the help that they need? How do we put systems in place so that way there's people, when people report things that happen to them, that people take the report seriously. There are so, I think, what Bob and Stephen talked about, this othering of the Asian American community, right? It makes it really easy to ignore what is happening in the community because when people say, where are you really from? That's the immediate assumption that we're not Americans and we don't belong. So therefore, if we target you and we hurt you, it doesn't really matter because you're not an American. And I think that's something that we're really working to push back on, and we're really demanding some action from our leaders in New York.
So could I jump in and add to Jo-Ann's point about the hypersexualization of Asian women, of Asian American women? And so, it begins in some ways with the 1875 Page Act, where, it targeted and constructed this notion of Chinese women as prostitutes. So that gets carried forward in cultural forums. I'd love to be able to talk about the history of film and the way that Asian female sexuality gets constructed. But then it also is very much impacted by the US Pacific Wars. So the presence of the US military in Asian countries and the way that the sex industry operated around US military bases, but then also supported by the scaffolding of discriminatory immigration laws, so that Amerasian children, so children born of U.S. servicemen, have much greater procedural hurdles to gain entry into the United States than if they had been born to a U.S. citizen mother. And that's, until very recently, it's given U.S. constitutional, approvals. Like, sure, it's fine to discriminate on that basis. But what it does is it allows for the U.S. military, and U.S. servicemen to have available Asian women in Asian countries in a way where there is no responsibility attached. And that gets carried forward into the United States.
Can I just make one follow-up comment on that? I wasn't going to say anything, but I feel like this ties into a larger point about what I was saying earlier about war and empire, about how that sort of matters on the ground in the lives of Asian Americans. So like, I read this really great book this past year. It's by cultural historian Carrie Tirado-Brahman, and the book's called American Niceness. And she explores how, throughout history, America has committed all sorts of atrocities, but then papered over them through the veneer of niceness. So in other words, like a lot of sort of acts of war, aggression, or empire were characterized in terms of America, liberating different countries, liberating Asia, which then of course drew attention away from atrocities. I think that's important because I think in the sort of everyday lives of Asian Americans, there are important moments, what I would describe as kind of citizenship affirming or citizenship conferring moments, like moments where you sort of affirm your citizenship, not just sort of legally, but I think politically and culturally. So one of those moments I think is the military. When we talk about the military in the US, there's a kind of reflexive desire to sort of like uphold the service members in the military. And of course, like I do have many friends who are in the military, and of course I'm always worried for their safety. On the other hand, I think, when I talk to a lot of Asian Americans, there's this kind of unspoken anxiety or ambivalence towards the military because of the sort of history that it has represented in our lives, right? This sort of like, I feel like I'm keyed in always on stories of like US service members committing some sort of act of assault or aggression or rape. And of course, that figures into my sort of reality and understanding of the military. And that is very much against the kind of impulse to affirm and sing the praise of the military that I think pervades in American culture. And I think that's the kind of anxiety that people don't often draw attention to as being an Asian American. Like that's what it is to be an Asian American in America, where you're an other. And yet the thing that you're being asked to affirm is also the thing that has caused great stress in your communities. So again, what do we learn about race when we center the experience of Asian Americans? I think that's one of those things.
And one thing I know exactly now that we're going to run out of time. So one thing that you all haven't talked about explicitly is the model minority myth. So I'm hoping someone can explain that, hopefully succinctly, due to time constraints, but also how it kind of the stakes of all of what we're talking about on individuals. So low-income Asian communities, I feel like a lot of times they're not getting as much, maybe in the law school setting too, as not as much attention because we assume that Asian people are more affluent because of the model minority myth, but also microaggressions, how that all ties together. I'm kind of just throwing things at you to see what you have to say.
I mean, I can give just sort of a brief, what I see as the brief harms of the model minority myth, but obviously others here can fill out the picture. So I think the short of it is that the model minority myth is this notion that Asian Americans, through hard work and perhaps through cultural advantage, have been able to succeed, even outpacing their white peers. And I think that there are two related harms with that myth. So one, of course, is what Bethan alluded to, which is that it washes away the heterogeneity in the Asian American community, so that it sort of unburdens government officials, it unburdens organizations from having to redirect resources into the Asian American community, because the assumption is that the Asian Americans are doing well, when of course there's a vast disparity that defines sort of certain groups from other groups related to class and migration history. But there's also a second related, and Asian Americans are often fixated on that, I think quite understandably. There's a second harm that Asian Americans, I don't hear Asian Americans talking about as often, and that has to do with the way that the model minority myth weaponizes Asian Americans against other communities of color, depending on the circumstance, especially against Black communities. So it's also a way to sanction or penalize or discipline other communities. And then again, it also serves to unburden the state, because if people, for example, feel like we need affirmative action policies or we need more expansive safety nets, the refusal is justified because the fault of that is not the state, but rather those communities. It's some sort of cultural default or laziness, because after all, Asian Americans have succeeded. So I would say that that's the harm. And I think that those are two related ones that, of course, spill into other different moments of organizing and legal recourse that make it very, very difficult.
And so if I can just jump in to add a little bit, and that's a great, succinct description of it. But, so when we think about the way that racial stratification operates, one of the concepts that I always go back to is W.E.B. Du Bois's psychological wages of whiteness. And what he was trying to understand was, why is it that poor whites go along with social policies that actually are bad for them? And part of it was the very specific intentional construction of privilege that operates so that poor whites get certain privileges. And so even though, working class whites might have actually more in common based on class with other racial minorities, they accept the psychological wages of whiteness and go along with white supremacy, even though it hurts them. And so when I think about the model minority myth, the other sort of aspect of it, which I think is challenging for the community, I'll say our communities, but it's whether we buy into it, whether we buy into what we might describe as the psychological wages of honorary whiteness. And so that's the question or political challenge, I think, that is before us.
And I'll just add quickly, in New York, I think, I know plenty of people who love that model minority myth, and they say to me, what's wrong with that, right? And, and then, people like me were like outwardly horrified. And I have to remind them that 1 in 4 Asians live in poverty in New York City. And, we're 16% of the population and we're the fastest growing, yet when you look at how the contract dollars are given out to the community, we get 1.4% of the city contract dollars, right? Which means that we are just chronically underserved. And, that needs to serve the Asian senior populations that are the fastest growing, and the poorest senior population. It's the fact that half of our city, that half the Asian Americans in our community have limited English proficiency, that we too have uncertain immigration status. And so, it's this broad brushstroke of model minority. It really does deny us very practical support, social services support to people to help our families. I mean, there's a long history of Asian families. The immigration history is really rich here, but yet we have families trapped in generational poverty because of this myth, this lie that they continue to perpetuate, so that way we are not being able to get the help that they need. And so this is how it plays out in the real world right now.
And then, Jo-Ann, you had mentioned already one microaggression that's very common, where being asked, where are you from? But I was hoping you all could focus on how these fit in. I feel like there's a lot of attention on microaggressions. It's easy to discard them because they happen in daily life, either by the person who's being aggressed against or the person who's committing, right? They pass by very quickly. It's hard to see them as serious when we're looking at people being killed for their identities. So can you explain how they tie into this bigger picture, but also give us some examples too? I mean, we all have them, right?
So I'm going to give you my favorite example of what happened to me, right? Because it happens to me a lot. I live in part of New York City, in Brooklyn, where it's like, this is where, hipster gentrification is born. Like, my neighborhood is the birthplace of that, right? So everybody claims so much, we're so woke. Can I tell you how many times I have dealt with microaggressions? It's the little small comments that eat at you, right? And so it's the fact that I can't go to my laundromat without somebody demanding that I help them. And, I have sworn very, like I have cursed people, in my most awesome Korean auntiness that like shake my fist and I shame people publicly, right? It's the fact that you assume certain things about me because of who I am. And so therefore you impose whatever your racist views on me by saying stupid things, and that deserves to be punished in a very public manner by people like me. But, I was invited to go meet with some of the immigration experts at the Obama administration, right before he was leaving. And so I worked late, so I had to figure out what I was going to wear. And I realized, oh my God, I haven't done laundry in a while. So I go to my laundromat, right? And it's one of those 24-hour places. So it was late at night. I'm sitting outside because I thought, okay, I'm going to be all right. I got here. And then this guy walks out, follows me, and he said, aren't you going to come in here? And I said, for what? And he said, because my girlfriend can't find her dress. The guy who's working there, he doesn't speak English, and he can't find out where her dress is. And I said, of course I know exactly what is happening, right? So I say, but why would you need me in there, right? And he says, because don't you work there? And then it just became like full Korean insane lady, right? Like, one, why do you assume that I live here? I work there, right? Like, two, I don't give a rat's ass about your girlfriend's dress, right? And the fact that you think that there's a problem with the guy who's Latino, right? And the fact that you're being a piece of shit to him makes me want to take you out. And so like he goes and he's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, right? So he goes in there, he tells his girlfriend, okay, we gotta go, right? So he's walking down the street, and this is like middle of the night in Brooklyn, and I am screaming all the way after him to be like, I don't live to serve you. You think all Asians do this, blah, 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 right? There's nothing wrong with, owning a laundromat, right? This is what our communities do. But it is the fact that he assumes that I'm gonna have a job, right? And that my job is to, serve him, right? And because this is what he thinks that all Asians do. And then I thought, UMF, I bet you tell your friends, you all go have Korean barbecue and you think you're so cool because you know how to order, right? But like, it was like full rage, right? And I know Bob and Steve are laughing. But I came home and I realized even when we get to have the kind of access that we have, right? And to be able to be invited to some really critical tables where we get to talk about and advocate for our communities, this is still the garbage that we have to deal with. It's this assumption that we are, people have like, this is what the Asians have, what kind of jobs they have. So therefore, you must serve me, right? And so, it's a story that I tell often because I think it really demonstrates what we deal with on a daily basis. And one more story, the Asian American Federation does a lot of work on mental health. And part of that mental health is the microaggression that our community deals with. And the very first workshop that we did, there was a young woman who was an attorney at her law firm. She came to talk about what she should do because she was absolutely miserable at her job. She has been there for a while. She's not the newest associate, right? But she's the only Asian woman on her team. So therefore, she was always the one to go ask to go get the coffee. And so she said, I'm really miserable. I cry every day. What should I do, right? You have to make some hard choices. I wish I had an answer for her, but it's the fact that like this is where we are, and the fact that everybody they're so enthralled with all things Koreans these days. We seem to be having our moment right now, but it's this constant, in that way it's the othering, and it's the fact that people impose what they think you are, who they think you are, onto you. And there are times when it feels really great to just let them have it, but it also just eats away at your soul because you think like, no matter how much I accomplish, no matter who I am, it's always how people see me, and the fact that they don't think that they're it's always so they downplay who you are, and it's the assumption that they make about you. So
if I could just quickly respond to my response to, oh, isn't that trivial? And Jo-Ann, what you've described is so not trivial. But, you know, in some ways, part of the problem is with the term microaggression, so tiny, right? And we don't really appreciate the effect that it has. But the other way that I think about it is that it's really like a pyramid. And so when you have that killing at the top, right, you know, that is done on the basis, on the foundation of all of the underlying microaggressions that are not addressed. And then the things above the microaggressions, the things above, and it goes, you know, it's a pyramid. You don't get that, you know, that the murders, you know, everybody isn't committing them, but it's really based on that foundation. And that's why it's so important to address, in addition to recognizing the direct harm that Jo-Ann spoke about.
I think Stephen might be waiting for the next question.
Yeah, just in the interest of time, I couldn't say anything better or in addition to what Jo-Ann and Bob have said.
So for our last question, and for everyone listening, I put my Zoom link into the chat so that you can all get to the after Zoom event. The last question I just want to ask our panelists to sum up, and we can go maybe 2 minutes over time here, takeaways. So what one takeaway do you hope the following types of attendees will walk away with? And you don't have to cover everyone, but I'm thinking people in the audience include those who are new, those who are familiar, law school faculty and staff, other people of color wanting to support Asians, and those who identify as AAPI. I know it's a tough one. I'm going to call on Bob because he's smiling. Jo-Ann's writing and Stephen motioned towards someone else.
Right. Well, you know, on my screen, Stephen was motioning toward Bethan. So I think he was thinking he was motioning toward me, but, you know, it's like, so, you know, takeaways, right? Well, you know, I hate doing these things and I love doing these things. You know, I hate doing these things because it's hard, you know, to continually mine and remember these things. But I love doing these things because so many people don't know this history. And so one of the takeaways, I hope that people who are Asian American will take away this history and think about this as, oh, this is part of my history. I hope that people of color attending this will say, oh, this is also part of our history. I hope that non-people of color will go away from this thinking, oh, this is part of our history. So I go back to Daniel Day Kim's testimony before, I think, a House Judiciary Committee on the anti-Asian incidents. And he said, this is what we're talking about is American history. This is not Asian American history. This is American history. And to own that. And so, you know, just in the interest of time, I'll say that I hope that that is a takeaway for people who are attending.
So I can jump in and say, I think the takeaway is you have to check your own prejudice, right? The assumptions that we make about each other is oftentimes wrong. And if you have questions, you should ask. You know, how many times do we get the question of where are you from? Where are you really from, right? The better question is, what is your ethnicity? What is your heritage? There are ways to ask questions that you want to get at without sounding like a raging racist. And so I think people need to learn some of that. And the takeaway for the Asian American community, you need to learn your history, exactly what Bob said. I can't tell you the conversations that I have around my dinner table with my young cousins and my nieces and nephews about Asian American history in America, you know, and how many times did I buy Professor Zin's book, right? And for all of them, that is required reading in our families. But and also to talk about, you know, what we're seeing in real life. I know that there's a lot of young Duke graduates who will be moving to New York. I hope you'll come in and volunteer, and I hope you will come in and there are lots of nonprofit organizations who need your help, who need your expertise. Please come and find us and support us. I think we now more than ever, we need you. And I think this is an incredible time of community awakening. And we're gonna need many, many hands to do the work. So always welcome extra hands.
Okay, so I guess I'll go. So as I said at the top of the hour, for me, it's been really important that I'm the child of immigrants. And I think that that has been the lens through which I've looked at a lot of these issues. And a part of it has to do with the fact that when I talked to Ara Palsa after the Atlanta shootings, one of the things I remarked on was that the conversations that we were having were the same conversations that I was having when I was in college, 25 years ago or whatever. And I think that's in part because we're a community that continues to grow through migration. And in other words, like you sort of have this kind of replenishing of the community, and you have a lot of these dynamics being reproduced over and over again through the years. And so for me, for the students here, I can't see you because it's a webinar setting, but I would imagine that many, if not most of you who are identified as Asian American would also identify as the children of immigrants. And I think that's important to sort of think about, because for our parent generation, in many ways, it's enough for them to survive, right? The sort of journey of migration, whatever country you're coming from, takes such a toll, both sort of the kind of, like drastic ones that we see in terms of health outcomes, but then also in the sort of microaggressions that we talked about. And in many ways, that was the thing that I found most personally tragic about the anti-Asian shootings in Atlanta, is that these people who immigrated, like they didn't survive the immigration process, right? And again, immigration is not just a movement from point A to point B. It's a continual process that goes into the incorporation into society, and ultimately their journey ended in death. They didn't survive it. So that for me, like that, I felt that the deepest. Now, what does that mean then? So for me, the takeaways is that for those of you who identify as children of immigrants, I think that also means that you bear a particular responsibility. There's a concept I've written about, it's called brokering. It's something I borrowed from social scientists. And you compare sort of like households where you have native born parents. And in those households, things like political education, access to network and resources, it's very much a top-down endeavor, right? Parents transfer knowledge to children. But if you look at households with immigrant parents, the transfer of knowledge is much more bidirectional. So from a younger age, children of immigrants have to take on more adult-like responsibilities, and that makes a lot of sense because, again, you're the ones who have language speaking ability, you're the ones who are going to school, you're the ones with access to resources and networks. So, and that causes all sorts of stress in the household, but it also means that you bear a particular responsibility. So to the extent that I think Asian Americans care about social change, to the extent that we care about trying to build relationships with communities of color, that we want to realize claims of racial justice, the responsibility falls on us, not our parents. So it's not just enough to, I think, hope that this will happen, that someone will make these things happen. And I think the Asian American context, if it's not us, if it's not the children of immigrants, it's just not going to happen. So again, as we think about how to translate this into momentum over the long term, I hope that all of us who, again, think about these things in those terms, embrace that and take opportunities to try and make interventions where we can, because again, if we don't, no one will.
So thank you again to our panelists. This is the end of our event. I've put my Zoom link into the chat again, so please join us. The panelists can't stay for too long, but can stick around for a bit. And you don't have to feel like you need a question or something amazing to say to them. They're happy to talk to you. And again, thank you to the Dean's Office for hosting this event. I hope this was a great experience for most of you. And I'm available as well. I'm at the law school. If we were in person, you could just stop by my office, but we're not. So you can always make a Zoom appointment with me or email me. Thank you so much.